Is recalculating. How do we use the Gospel of Mark as our GPS to make sure that as disciples of Jesus Christ, we're heading in the right direction? And so we use the Gospel to center us, to focus us, and to redirect us so that we're truly in our lives becoming faithful disciples of Jesus Christ. Last week when we gathered, we looked at moving from fear to freedom and looking at that tiny mustard seed and allowing that seed of faith to grow so that we're freed up to be who Jesus calls us to be. And right after we hear this story, the disciples are in the boat and they forget about the mustard seed and the faith and letting it grow. Today's gospel is a vivid picture of the power of fear. Today's gospel is a vivid picture of the power of fear. We know most of the time in our lives how to dress for storms. We know that when there's a storm in winter, we've got to put on a heavy coat. We've got to make sure we've got boots on. We make sure we get gloves on. We make sure we've got a good hat that makes sure our head stays warm. And we know when we go driving, to be safe, we know we've got to put on a seatbelt. And how important, I will never forget to wear my seatbelt because that saved me, even though I broke my clavicle, that saved me from getting killed when I was hit head-on a few years ago. And I know that I've got to put that seatbelt on. I'll never forget to put on the seatbelt. It saved my life. We know that when we go boating, if we want to be safe, we've got to put on a life preserver. We've got to make sure that we've got a life jacket on so that we're safe. What about the storms of life? Because we all have them. No one's immune from the storms of life. We know what it's like when we've been diagnosed with a serious illness, or we know somebody who has a serious illness. You know the storms of life that come up when you lose a job and you don't know if you're going to be able to find one, or you can't make your payments on your home. You know the storms of life that come when your marriage isn't working out and things are falling apart, or a child is being bullied at school. And maybe you don't have any of those big storms in life, but you have a lot of little ones that are not insignificant, and they become overwhelming. What do you do in those storms? What do you wear? And I'm recommending that in the storms of our life, that we make sure we have our heart wear on. That we have our heart wear on. I have had many storms in my life. And what I do when I face those storms is I call upon God for the grace to bear the storm and to be with the storm. The first thing I do is I recognize there's a storm. And that means paying attention to your life. You know that sometimes you know people that have storms going on in their lives and they don't know it. No clue. They have no idea that their life is messed up. And sometimes we need to be the person that sits down with them and helps them to recognize the storm. We need to first of all recognize the storm when it's stormy in our lives. The second thing I do in asking for the grace to be with this storm is I ask the question that Jesus asked the disciples. What are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Why are you terrified? What's causing me to be so upset? Why am I overwhelmed? And that's inner work. It's sitting down in the midst of a storm and asking ourselves, why am I afraid? Why is this situation causing me so much stress? Why is this happening? And we all want the storm to go away. And we have short memories. We forget about the pain of the storm, and we want it taken away. But I next ask, once I know what I'm afraid of, I ask God, can you help me weather this storm? Can you give me the grace to weather this storm? Don't take it away. Give me the grace to weather this storm. Help me to make it through. And sometimes it's easy. The disciples are on the boat, and this terrible storm is coming, the water's coming in, and Jesus is asleep. And sometimes we think Jesus is asleep in our own lives. You know, we want to wake him up. But believe me, the Lord is awake, and he wants to give us the life preserver that we need to make it through the storm. What we need to do is ask for the grace to make it through that storm. And the grace that comes sometimes is the grace that comes, the outer storm, the external storm doesn't change. Sometimes it does. But I find out when I ask myself, what am I afraid of? The outside storm doesn't seem to be as bad when I recognize why I am afraid. And for some reason, the grace that comes from God in claiming, this is why I am afraid. This is what I'm afraid of. I'm able to weather the storm in a much better way. All of us have storms in our life. Do we have our hardware on? Do we have Jesus in the presence of our heart? And are we able to allow the Lord to truly carry us through, to help us make it, to weather the storm? Not to take the storm away, but to weather the storm. And so, 3 easy points when you witness and have the storms of your life. Recognize the storm, or if you see somebody that's having a stormy life, sit down with them and help them to recognize the storm. Then ask that question. And it's sometimes painful to sit down and say, what am I afraid of? But I'll tell you, once you get in touch with what you're afraid of, then you ask the Lord, can you help me weather this? Can you help me to move, like we talked last week, from fear to freedom in the midst of the storms of life? Amen.